Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. We should have never gone to Pine Hollow. I'm Michael Williams, I was 31 back then, and this is the story of how I lost everything. The camping trip was supposed to be a celebration. After 3 years of marriage, Sarah and I had finally saved enough to buy our first house, and our real estate agent had suggested we take a weekend to really think about such a big decision before signing the papers Monday morning. Our 7-year-old daughter, Emma, had been begging for a family camping adventure, and the borrowed RV from Sarah's brother seemed like the perfect solution. "It'll be like a trial run for family vacations," Sarah said as we loaded supplies into the 30-foot Jayco. "See how we all handle being cooped up together in a small space." Emma bounced around the RV's interior with unbridled excitement, claiming the bunk above the cab as her personal fortress. At 7, she had her mother's adventurous spirit and my stubborn curiosity, a combination that usually led to minor disasters but always made life interesting. "Can we see bears, Daddy?" she asked, pressing her face against the window as we pulled out of our apartment complex in Rochester. "And wolves? And maybe a moose. We'll see what we can find, kiddo," I promised, though privately I hoped we'd encounter nothing more dangerous than squirrels. Sarah had found Pine Hollow Family Campground through one of those family travel websites, complete with glowing reviews about kid-friendly activities and pristine wilderness. The photos showed spacious RV sites nestled among towering pines, a small lake perfect for fishing, and hiking trails suitable for children. "Look at this," she'd said, showing me the website. "They have a playground, organized activities for kids, and it's only 2 hours from Rochester, perfect for a long weekend." The drive north took us through increasingly rural countryside, past farms and small towns that looked like postcards from a simpler era. Emma entertained herself by counting cows and playing license plate games, while Sarah navigated using the detailed directions the campground had emailed us. "Turn right at the old church with the broken steeple," she read aloud. "Follow the gravel road for 6 miles until you see the Painted Rock." Painted Rock? I glanced at the directions. That's oddly specific. "Small-town landmarks," Sarah said with a shrug. "Probably makes sense to the locals." We found the church easily enough, a white wooden structure that looked like it hadn't seen a congregation in decades, its steeple listing at a dangerous angle. The gravel road beyond it wound through dense forest, forcing me to reduce speed as the RV swayed over deep ruts and loose stones. "This is taking forever," Emma complained from her perch in the cab. "Are we there yet?" "Almost, sweetheart," Sarah said, though she was frowning at the directions. The Painted Rock should be coming up soon. When we finally found it, the landmark was unmistakable. A boulder the size of a small car, covered in what looked like Native American pictographs and more recent graffiti. Some of the symbols were clearly modern, initials and dates carved by generations of teenagers, but others looked far older, worn smooth by weather and time. "Creepy," Emma announced with the frank honesty of childhood. "It looks like a giant face." She was right. From a certain angle, the arrangement of symbols and natural rock formations created the suggestion of a massive face staring up at the sky, its mouth open in either a scream or a song. Pine Hollow Family Campground lay just beyond the Painted Rock, nestled in a valley between tree-covered hills. The entrance was marked by a cheerful wooden sign decorated with cartoon bears and camping families, though the paint was faded and several letters were missing. The main building looked like a classic Adirondack lodge, all rough-hewn logs and green trim, with smoke rising from a stone chimney. A smaller building nearby bore a sign reading "Camp Store and Game Room," while a third structure appeared to house shower facilities. "It's perfect," Sarah breathed, taking in the scene, just like the photos. But something felt off to me, though I couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the absolute silence. No sounds of children playing, no voices from other campers, not even the hum of generators or air conditioners. For a family campground in peak autumn season, Pine Hollow seemed unusually quiet. We pulled up to the main lodge where a hand-lettered sign instructed visitors to ring the bell for service. Emma ran ahead to press the large brass bell mounted beside the door, its deep tone echoing across the valley like a church bell calling the faithful to worship. After several minutes, the door opened to reveal a woman of perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she spent most of her time outdoors. Her smile was warm, but seemed to require effort, as if she was out of practice. "You must be the Williams family," she said. "I'm Janet Morrison, the campground manager. Welcome to Pine Hollow." "Beautiful place," I said, shaking her hand. "Very peaceful." "We pride ourselves on maintaining the wilderness experience," Janet replied. "No cell service, limited Wi-Fi, just you and nature. Perfect for families who want to really connect with each other." She led us into the lodge's main room, which was decorated with hunting trophies and vintage camping equipment. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, while the others were covered with photographs spanning what looked like decades of family camping memories. "How long has the campground been operating?" Sarah asked, studying the photos. "Since 1962, Janet said with obvious pride. "My husband's family built this place, passed it down through 3 generations. We've hosted thousands of families over the years." Emma had wandered over to examine a display case full of what appeared to be Native American artifacts. Arrowheads, pottery shards, and carved bone tools. "Are these real?" she asked. "Very real," Janet confirmed. "This valley has been used by people for thousands of years. The Mohawk considered it sacred, a place where the spirits of the forest gathered. We found evidence of seasonal camps dating back to pre-Columbian times." She provided us with a detailed map of the campground and surrounding trails, along with a list of rules that seemed standard enough. Quiet hours after 10 p.m., no loud music, children must be supervised near the lake, stay on marked trails when hiking. "One thing," she added as we prepared to leave. "We ask that families stick together, especially after dark. The woods can be confusing, and it's easy to get turned around. We've had people wander off and get lost before." "What kind of lost?" I asked. Janet's smile flickered. "Oh, disoriented, following game trails instead of marked paths. Usually we find them within a few hours, but it can be frightening for everyone involved. We found our assigned site without difficulty. Spot number 13, right at the edge of the campground with an unobstructed view of the forest. The site was spacious and well-maintained, with a picnic table, fire ring, and all the necessary utility hookups. "Why is it so quiet?" Emma asked as we set up camp. "Where are all the other kids?" That was a good question. Despite Janet's talk about hosting thousands of families, we appeared to be the only guests. Several other RV sites showed signs of recent use. Tire tracks in the gravel, ash in the fire rings, but no actual campers were visible. "Maybe everyone else is out hiking," Sarah suggested, though she sounded uncertain. "We'll probably see them at dinner time." We spent the afternoon exploring the immediate area around our campsite. The campground was larger than it had appeared from the road, with dozens of sites scattered throughout the forest. Many were clearly designed for families, with playground equipment and designated areas for children's activities. But every site we visited was empty, creating an eerie ghost town atmosphere. It was as if hundreds of people had simply vanished, leaving behind only the infrastructure of their presence. "I want to go home," Emma announced as we walked past yet another abandoned playground. "This place is creepy." "It's just quiet, honey," Sarah said, though I could hear the strain in her voice. "Some people like peaceful vacations." That evening, we built a fire and cooked hot dogs over the flames, trying to recapture the family camping spirit we'd imagined. Emma seemed to relax as darkness fell, entertained by the dancing flames and the novelty of eating dinner outdoors. "Tell me a story, Daddy," she said, settling into my lap as Sarah cleaned up the dishes. I launched into one of her favorites, a tale about a brave princess who befriended forest animals and went on adventures. But as I spoke, I became aware that we were being watched. Nothing obvious, just the prickle of unseen eyes and the occasional snap of a twig breaking in the darkness beyond our fire's reach. "Someone's out there," Emma whispered, interrupting my story. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She pointed toward the tree line. I can see them. They're watching us. I followed her gaze but saw nothing except the shifting shadows cast by our fire. It's just the trees, kiddo. Sometimes they look like people in the dark. But Emma shook her head emphatically. No, Daddy. There are people standing in the trees. They're not moving, just watching. Sarah joined us by the fire, following our conversation with growing concern. Emma, honey, there's nobody there. You're just imagining things. I'm not imagining. Emma's voice rose with frustration. There's a man right there, and a lady, and I think there are kids, too. Despite my rational certainty that she was seeing shadows and letting her imagination run wild, I found myself studying the forest edge more carefully. The dancing firelight created constantly shifting patterns of light and shadow, and several times I could have sworn I glimpsed human shapes among the trees. Let's get you ready for bed, Sarah said, scooping Emma up. You're tired, and tired eyes play tricks. But as we prepared Emma for sleep in the RV's small bedroom, she continued to insist that people were watching us from the forest. She pressed her face to the window, pointing at specific spots and describing what she saw with disturbing detail. The man has on old clothes, like from the pictures at the lodge, and the lady is wearing a dress that goes all the way to the ground. The kids look scared, Daddy. Why do they look scared? I joined her at the window, straining to see whatever had captured her attention. The forest was dark except where our exterior lights penetrated a few feet into the undergrowth. But as I watched, something moved. Not the random motion of wind-blown branches, but something deliberate and human-shaped. There, Emma whispered. Do you see him now? For just a moment, I did. A tall figure standing motionless between two pine trees, close enough that I should have been able to make out details, but somehow remaining indistinct, like a photograph taken with a shaky camera. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Daddy? Emma's voice was small and frightened. Who are they? What do they want? I don't know, sweetheart, but they're not going to hurt us. Daddy and Mommy are right here. Sarah appeared in the doorway, having overheard the conversation. What's going on? Emma thinks she sees people in the woods, and honestly, I hesitated, not wanting to frighten either of them. I might have seen something too. Seen what? Someone standing between the trees. But when I looked directly, they were gone. Sarah moved to the window, scanning the forest edge. I don't see anything. They're still there, Emma insisted. More of them now. They're all around us. I decided to investigate. Despite Sarah's protests, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, leaving the women in the relative safety of the RV. The night air was cold and still, carrying the scent of pine needles and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of compost or decay. Hello, I called out, feeling somewhat foolish. Is someone out there? The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth but revealing no sign of human presence. I walked toward the spot where I thought I'd seen the figure, my feet crunching on fallen leaves. But as I moved deeper into the forest, I began to find evidence that people had been here recently. Footprints in the soft earth, some appearing fresh, broken branches at human height, and carved into the bark of several trees, symbols that looked similar to those I'd seen on the painted rock. Who's there? I called again, louder this time. The response came not as words, but as movement. Dozens of shadows shifting between the trees, always at the edge of my vision, never quite solid enough to focus on. I spun in circles trying to catch one in my flashlight beam, but they moved with impossible speed and silence. Then I heard Emma screaming. I ran back toward the RV, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs in my haste. The screaming continued. Not the cry of a child having a nightmare, but the sound of genuine terror. I burst through the RV door to find Sarah holding Emma, both of them staring out the front window with expressions of absolute horror. They're everywhere, Sarah whispered. Jesus Christ, Michael, they're everywhere. I looked where they were pointing and felt my blood turn to ice. The forest around our campsite was full of people, dozens of them, standing motionless between the trees like an army of statues. Men, women, and children of all ages, all wearing clothes that looked decades out of date. But something was wrong with them beyond their vintage clothing. They stood too still, breathed too quietly, and their faces reflected the RV's exterior lights with an unnatural pallor that suggested they weren't entirely alive. "What do they want?" Emma sobbed. "Why won't they go away?" As if responding to her question, the figures began to move. Not walking exactly, but gliding forward with a fluid motion that seemed to ignore the rough terrain. They approached from all directions, forming an ever-tightening circle around our RV. "Start the engine," Sarah said. "We're leaving. Now." I didn't argue. The keys were in my pocket, and the RV's diesel engine turned over on the first try. But as I shifted into reverse, I realized we had a problem. The figures had positioned themselves directly behind us, blocking our exit route. "Drive through them," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "I can't run over people, even if they're—" I paused, not sure how to finish that sentence. "Even if they're what? Dead? Because that's what they are, Michael. Look at them." She was right. Up close, the figures surrounding us showed clear signs of decay. Clothes rotted and stained with earth, skin that had taken on the waxy pallor of death, and eyes that reflected light like those of nocturnal animals. The nearest figure pressed its face against the driver's side window, leaving a smear of something dark and oily on the glass. When it opened its mouth, I could see that its teeth had been filed to points, and when it spoke, its voice sounded like wind through a graveyard. "Welcome to Pine Hollow," it said. "We've been waiting for you." More voices joined the first, creating a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from all directions. "Stay with us. Join us. Become part of the family." "They're not solid," I realized, watching as several figures walked directly through the picnic table without disturbing it. "They can't actually stop us." I pressed the accelerator and the RV lurched forward. The ghostly figures didn't move aside, but they didn't impede our progress either. We simply passed through them like driving through fog. But as we broke free of the circle, I heard Emma scream again. "Daddy, stop! There's a little girl!" In the headlights, directly ahead of us, stood a child of perhaps Emma's age. Unlike the other figures, this one seemed solid, real, and terrified. She wore a white nightgown that fluttered in a wind I couldn't feel, and her pale face was streaked with what might have been tears. I slammed on the brakes, the RV's anti-lock system engaging with a grinding sound. The child looked up at us with eyes that held depths of sadness I'd never seen in someone so young. "Help me," she mouthed, though no sound came from her lips. "Please, help me." Emma was struggling against Sarah's grip, trying to open the RV door. "We have to help her, Daddy. She's scared." "Emma, no!" Sarah pulled her back. "It's not real. It's not a real little girl, but the child in our headlights looked real enough." She approached the RV slowly, one hand extended as if asking for help. As she drew closer, I could see details that made my heart break. Scraped knees, tangled hair, a face that spoke of recent trauma and desperate need. "Mommy, we can't leave her," Emma sobbed. "She needs us." The little girl reached the RV and pressed both hands against the windshield. Her mouth moved urgently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Don't leave me here. Take me with you. Please." For a moment, I wavered. Every parental instinct screamed at me to help a child in distress, regardless of the supernatural circumstances. But then I noticed details that chilled me to the bone. The girl cast no reflection in the RV's mirrors. Her breath didn't fog the glass despite the cold night air, and behind her, barely visible in the darkness, I could see the other figures watching with expressions of predatory hunger. "It's a trap," I whispered. "They're using her to make us open the door." As if hearing my words, the child's expression changed from desperate plea to something far more sinister. Her eyes went completely black, and when she smiled, I saw the same filed teeth that marked the adult figures. "Let me in," she said, her voice now audible through the glass. "Let me in, and I'll show you such wonderful things." I floored the accelerator, and the RV surged forward. The child thing leaped aside with inhuman speed. but not before raking her fingernails across the windshield with a sound like breaking glass. We drove through the forest on what barely qualified as a road, branches scraping the RV's roof and sides as I pushed the vehicle beyond any reasonable speed for the terrain. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something worse. The sound of things moving through the trees, keeping pace with our desperate flight. "Where's the main road?" Sarah asked, studying the campground map with a flashlight. "This can't be the only way out." But the map showed Pine Hollow as a dead end, accessible only by the gravel road we'd taken to reach it, and that road seemed to have changed, branching and splitting in ways that defied the printed directions we'd followed earlier. "Everything looks different," I said, fighting to keep the RV on what passed for a path. "It's like the forest is shifting around us." Emma had stopped crying and was staring out the rear window with an expression of grim fascination. "They're following us, Daddy. All of them. And there are more now." I glanced in the rear-view mirror and saw lights moving between the trees. Not electric lights, but the cold phosphorescence of decay. Dozens of figures glided through the forest, easily keeping pace with the RV despite the rough terrain. "What do they want?" Sarah asked. "Us," Emma said with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. "They want us to stay with them forever." For 2 hours, we drove through a maze of forest roads that seemed to lead nowhere. Every path we took brought us back to familiar landmarks. The Painted Rock, the abandoned church, the entrance to Pine Hollow. We were trapped in some kind of supernatural labyrinth, condemned to drive in circles while our fuel gauge dropped steadily toward empty. "This is impossible," Sarah said after our fourth encounter with the Painted Rock. "Roads don't just rearrange themselves." But the evidence was undeniable. The forest around Pine Hollow operated by rules that had nothing to do with normal geography. Time seemed fluid, too. My watch showed that we'd been driving for hours, but the sky remained stubbornly dark, as if dawn was being held back by some unseen force. Finally, as the fuel gauge touched empty, I had no choice but to stop. We sat in the dark RV, surrounded by the sound of our own breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the pines. "What now?" Sarah asked. Before I could answer, Emma pointed out the window. "Look." The forest around us was filling with lights, hundreds of them, moving between the trees like a procession of candles. As they drew closer, I could see they were carried by the ghostly figures we'd encountered at the campground. Men, women, and children of all ages, all wearing the clothes of different eras, all bearing the unmistakable marks of death. But they weren't threatening now. Instead, they seemed almost welcoming. They formed a circle around the RV, their faces showing expressions of sad understanding rather than predatory hunger. One figure approached closer than the rest, a middle-aged man in clothes that looked like they belonged to the 1960s. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost fatherly. "You can't leave," he said. "None of us can leave. But it's not so bad once you accept it. We're all family here." "Family?" Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "The Morrison family," the man explained, gesturing to include all the figures surrounding us. "Janet told you about us, didn't she? 3 generations of campground owners. We never really left Pine Hollow. This is our home." More figures stepped forward, and I began to recognize faces from the photographs in the lodge. Camping families spanning decades, all preserved in the supernatural amber of this cursed place. "Every year, new families come," the man continued. "Some leave, but the special ones, the ones who really belong, they stay. They become part of the Pine Hollow family." "We're not staying," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. The man smiled sadly. "You don't have a choice. None of us did. But look around you. Is this really so terrible? No bills to pay, no jobs to worry about, no aging or sickness, just eternal family togetherness in the most beautiful place on earth." Emma pressed her face against the window, studying the ghostly children who had gathered near the RV. "They look lonely," she said. "The kids look really lonely." "They are," the man admitted. "We all are. That's why we need new families to join us, to bring life and laughter back to Pine Hollow." I looked at Sarah and saw the exhaustion in her eyes. the temptation to simply give up and accept whatever fate awaited us. We'd been fighting for hours with no sign of escape, and our daughter was showing signs of the psychological trauma that would mark her for life if we somehow survived this experience. "What happens if we agree?" I asked. "You become part of the family. Your daughter would have dozens of playmates, friends who would never leave her or grow up and move away. You and your wife would have eternal peace, free from all the worries that plague the living. And if we refuse?" The man's expression didn't change, but somehow his meaning was clear. There is no refusing. Pine Hollow chooses its families, and you've been chosen. The only question is whether you accept willingly or fight until exhaustion makes the choice for you. Around us, the ghostly figures began to close in, their movements slow but inexorable. I realized we were witnessing a process that had been repeated countless times over the decades. Families lured to Pine Hollow by seemingly innocent camping vacations, only to discover they could never leave. But then, Emma did something unexpected. She opened the RV door. "Emma, no!" Sarah lunged for her, but our daughter was already stepping outside. The ghostly figures stopped moving, all of them focusing on the small girl standing in their midst. Emma looked around at the assembled spirits with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. "You're all really sad," she said. "Why are you so sad?" The man who had been speaking to us knelt down to Emma's level. "We miss the world, little one. We miss being alive." "Then why don't you just leave?" It was such a simple question, asked with such innocent logic, that it seemed to stagger the assembled spirits. They looked at each other with expressions of confusion, as if the possibility had never occurred to them. "We can't," the man said finally. "This is our home. This is where we belong." "But you don't like it here," Emma pointed out. "Nobody should have to stay somewhere that makes them sad." She walked up to the nearest ghostly child, a boy of perhaps 10 years old wearing clothes from the 1970s. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy whispered. "Tommy Morrison." "Hi, Tommy. I'm Emma. Do you want to play with me?" The boy nodded eagerly, but Emma shook her head. "Not here, though. This place is too sad. We should go somewhere fun, like a real playground." "I can't leave Pine Hollow," Tommy said. "None of us can." "Says who?" It was another devastatingly simple question. Tommy looked around at the other spirits, seeking an answer none of them seemed to have. The rules," he said finally. "We have to stay. We're the Pine Hollow family. But families don't keep each other prisoner," Emma said with the absolute moral certainty of childhood. "That's not what families do." I watched in amazement as my 7-year-old daughter did something that Sarah and I had been unable to accomplish with all our adult reasoning and desperate struggle. She was showing the spirits a truth they had forgotten, that they were choosing to remain trapped, bound not by supernatural forces but by their own acceptance of the limitations placed upon them. The man who had spoken to us stood slowly, his expression showing dawning comprehension. "She's right," he said to the other spirits. "We've been holding ourselves here. We've been so focused on keeping Pine Hollow alive that we forgot how to live ourselves." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled figures. Some began to fade immediately, their forms becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. Others lingered, as if saying goodbye to a place that had been both prison and home for decades. "Thank you, little one," the man said to Emma. "You've given us something we'd lost, permission to let go." Within minutes, all the spirits had vanished except for Tommy Morrison. He stood looking at Emma with an expression of deep gratitude. "Will you be okay?" Emma asked. Tommy nodded. "I think so. I think I've been okay for a long time. But I just forgot." He began to fade like the others, but paused for one last message. "Tell Janet thank you too. Tell her she doesn't have to keep watching over us anymore." Then he was gone, and we were alone in the forest. The change was immediate and dramatic. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Pine Hollow lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. The twisted forest roads straightened themselves into sensible paths, and our GPS suddenly sprang to life, showing our exact location and the route back to civilization. We drove in silence for the first hour, each of us processing what we'd experienced. Emma fell asleep in her bunk, exhausted by events that should have traumatized her for life, but somehow seemed to have left her strangely peaceful. "How did she know?" Sarah asked eventually. "How did a 7-year-old figure out something that trapped hundreds of people for decades?" "Kids see things differently," I said. "They don't automatically accept that things can't be changed. They don't assume that the way things are is the way things have to be." We reached Rochester as the sun was rising, the normal world looking strange and precious after our night in the supernatural landscape of Pine Hollow. But before going home, I insisted on making one more stop. The nursing home where Janet Morrison lived was a cheerful place, filled with the kind of controlled activity that characterizes facilities for people with dementia. We found her in the common room, staring out a window with the distant expression of someone lost in memories. "Mrs. Morrison?" I approached carefully. "We met yesterday at Pine Hollow." She turned to look at me, and for a moment her eyes cleared with recognition. "You got out," she said. "You and your family." "How?" "Your grandson Tommy asked me to give you a message. He says thank you, and that you don't have to keep watching over them anymore." Janet's eyes filled with tears. "They're gone? They're really gone?" "They're free," Sarah said gently. "All of them. Your whole family." The old woman wept then, tears of relief rather than sorrow. "I've been running that place for 40 years, she said. "Ever since my husband died in the campground fire of 1982. I couldn't leave because they were all still there, all the families who never made it out. But I kept hoping someday someone would find a way to help them." "A fire?" I asked. "Started in the lodge kitchen during a family reunion. Spread so fast that 37 people were trapped. They never found all the bodies. The lake was too deep, and the woods too dense. But they were still there, still waiting for someone to understand that they didn't have to stay." We left Janet with the staff who promised to look after her, and drove home to our normal life. The house we'd planned to buy seemed less important now, though we went through with the purchase. After spending a night in the supernatural realm of Pine Hollow, having a place that was truly ours felt like the most precious thing in the world. Emma never talked about our experience directly, but I noticed changes in her behavior. She was kinder to other children, especially ones who seemed lonely or left out. And sometimes I'd catch her talking to empty corners of her room, as if comforting invisible friends. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" I asked one evening. "Tommy," she said matter-of-factly. "He visits sometimes. He's not sad anymore, but he likes to check on me." I should have been concerned about my daughter's apparent ongoing contact with the spirit world. But, given what we'd experienced at Pine Hollow, it seemed natural that some connections might persist. And if Tommy Morrison wanted to visit the little girl who had given him the courage to move on, who was I to object? The Pine Hollow family campground was permanently closed by the state 6 months later, after investigators discovered that the business had been operating without proper licenses for over a decade. The land was returned to the state forest system, and the buildings were demolished. But sometimes when I'm driving through the Adirondacks on business trips, I'll catch a glimpse of a gravel road that looks familiar, or see a painted rock that reminds me of an ancient face. And I'll remember the lesson Emma taught us that night, that sometimes the most powerful prisons are the ones we build for ourselves, and the most important freedom is the permission to let go. The spirits of Pine Hollow found their peace through the wisdom of a 7-year-old girl who understood something adults had forgotten, that love doesn't trap people, and real families don't keep each other prisoner in places that make them sad. They're free now, all of them. And so, in a way that I couldn't have imagined before that night, are we. I never believed in the stories they told about Hocking Hills, until what happened to me out there. My name is Rebecca Hill. I'm 28 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. The plan had been simple enough. A girls' weekend in my brother's borrowed RV, somewhere far from the city where we could disconnect and remember what friendship felt like before careers and relationships complicated everything. Katie had found the spot online, a private campground called Cedar Hollow RV Resort, nestled in a valley between the Finger Lakes and the southern edge of the Adirondack foothills. "Look at this place," she'd said, showing me the website on her phone. "Secluded sites, hiking trails, and get this, no cell service, complete digital detox. I should have questioned why that was being marketed as a selling point. I should have wondered why a campground would brag about its isolation. But after 6 months of 60-hour work weeks at the marketing firm and the messy end of my relationship with Derek, the promise of silence sounded like salvation. Jen was already packed and ready when we picked her up Friday morning, her usual manic energy barely contained in her compact frame. At 31, she was the oldest of our trio and supposedly the most responsible, though her recent divorce had left her making increasingly reckless decisions. The RV trip was her idea originally, a way to prove she didn't need her ex-husband for adventure. "Road trip," she announced, tossing her duffel bag into the RV's storage compartment. God, I've missed this. Remember when we used to just take off for the weekend without planning every detail to death? Katie laughed, adjusting her perfectly organized camping supplies. At 26, she was the youngest, but also the planner, the one who made color-coded itineraries and researched the best restaurants within a 50-mile radius of wherever we were going. The chaos of divorce proceedings had been harder on her than she admitted. She needed structure, predictability, the illusion of control. "I planned plenty," she protested. "I just didn't overplan. There's a difference." The drive north took us through increasingly rural countryside, past small towns that looked like they'd been frozen in time somewhere around 1950. The last real city we passed was Utica, and after that, the landscape became a rolling carpet of forests broken only by the occasional farm or gas station. My phone lost signal around noon, somewhere between a place called Poland and another called Cold Brook. Katie's GPS held out a bit longer, but by the time we turned off the main highway onto increasingly narrow back roads, we were navigating by the printed directions the campground had emailed. "This is exactly what I needed," Jen said, hanging her arm out the passenger window as we wound through tunnels of overhanging maples. No emails, no lawyers, no well-meaning friends asking how I'm holding up. Just us and the wilderness. But the wilderness felt different than I'd expected. Too quiet, maybe, or too watchful. The trees pressed close to the road, their branches creating a canopy so thick that afternoon felt like dusk. Even with the windows down, there were no sounds, no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Katie noticed it too. "It's really quiet out here," she said, turning down the radio. "Where are all the birds?" "Probably just the wrong time of day," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "They'll be more active around dawn and dusk." We found Cedar Hollow RV Resort at the end of a gravel road that seemed to go on forever, winding deeper into the forest with each turn. The entrance was marked by a weathered wooden sign, the letters barely legible under decades of weather damage and what looked like claw marks. Beyond the entrance, a small valley opened up, carpeted in autumn gold grass and dotted with RV sites arranged around a central building that might once have been a barn. Only 2 other RVs were visible, both at the far end of the campground, their windows dark despite the afternoon sun. "Cozy," Jen observed. "Hope we like each other's company." The office was housed in what had definitely been a barn at some point, complete with the sliding doors and weathered red paint of a century-old farm building. A small sign directed visitors to ring the bell for assistance, but when Katie pressed the button, the sound seemed to echo forever without bringing any response. "Hello," she called out, cupping her hands around her mouth. "Anyone here?" After several minutes, a door creaked open and a woman emerged from the shadows inside the building. She was perhaps 60, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and clothes that looked like they'd been ordered from a 1950s farm catalog. "Help you girls?" Her voice was flat, emotionless, with the kind of accent that placed her generations deep in these hills. "We have a reservation," Katie said, pulling out her phone to show the confirmation email. 3 nights, starting today." The woman, her name tag read Martha, barely glanced at the phone. "Don't get much signal out here." "What name?" "Hill, Rebecca Hill." Martha nodded slowly and disappeared back into the barn's interior. We could hear her moving around inside, the sound of papers shuffling and drawers opening. When she returned, she carried an old-fashioned paper register and a set of keys attached to a wooden paddle. "Site 12, she said, pointing toward a spot near the tree line. Quiet hours start at sundown. No loud music, no generators after 9. Stay on the marked trails if you go walking. She paused, her pale eyes fixing on each of us in turn. And don't go into the woods after dark. Things get turned around out there. What kind of things? Jen asked with a laugh. Martha's expression didn't change. The kind that don't come back the same. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. Finally, Katie cleared her throat. Well, thank you. We'll be sure to stay on the trails. We paid in cash, the only payment method accepted according to a hand-lettered sign, and drove our rented RV to Site 12. The spot was perfect in an eerie sort of way, tucked into a grove of ancient pines with enough space for our awning and camp chairs. A fire ring sat in the center of the site, filled with ashes that looked recent despite the apparent lack of other campers. "This is going to be amazing," Katie said as we set up camp. "When's the last time we spent a whole weekend without checking our phones?" But even as she spoke, I noticed her glancing repeatedly at her dead phone, the habit too ingrained to break easily. Jen was having similar withdrawal symptoms, unconsciously reaching for her device every few minutes. "We should explore a bit before dinner," I suggested. "Get a feel for the area." The campground had several trail markers visible from our site, each bearing the same crude wooden signs we'd seen at the entrance. But these were different somehow. The symbols carved into them seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly, never quite the same from moment to moment. We started with what appeared to be the main trail, a well-worn path that led from the central area into the deeper woods. The markers were spaced at regular intervals, each one bearing symbols that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. "Weird artwork," Jen commented, running her finger along one of the carvings. "Local folk art, maybe?" But there was something unsettling about the symbols, something that spoke to a deeper part of the brain where instincts lived. They reminded me of pictures I'd seen in anthropology textbooks, cave paintings left by cultures that understood things we'd forgotten. The trail led us deeper into woods that grew darker with each step, despite the afternoon sun still visible through the canopy. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the leaf-covered path. "How far does this go?" Katie asked after we'd been walking for what felt like an hour. I checked my watch, surprised to see that only 15 minutes had passed. The time distortion was disorienting, as if the forest operated by different rules than the outside world. "Let's head back," I said. "We can explore more tomorrow." But when we turned around, the trail looked different. The markers we'd passed seemed to be in new positions, and several times I could have sworn we were walking in circles, passing the same distinctive rock formations repeatedly. "Are we lost?" Katie's voice carried a note of panic. "Can't be," Jen said, though she sounded less certain than usual. We stayed on the marked trail. It took us another hour to find our way back to the campground, following a path that definitely hadn't been there on the way in. By the time we emerged from the tree line, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. "Well, that was an adventure," Jen said, trying to inject some humor into the situation. "Good thing we're not actual hikers," but I could see the unease in both my friends' faces. Something about the forest felt wrong. Not just quiet, but actively hostile, as if it resented our presence and was working to drive us away. We cooked dinner on the camp stove, grilled chicken and vegetables that tasted better than anything I'd eaten in weeks. The simple act of preparing food together, without the distractions of technology, brought back memories of college camping trips and simpler times. "This was exactly what I needed," Katie said, raising her beer in a toast. "To getting back to basics. To friendship," Jen added. "To not checking our phones every 5 minutes," I finished, and we all laughed. But as darkness settled over the valley, the laughter became forced. The silence that had seemed peaceful during daylight felt oppressive now, broken only by the occasional crack of settling wood or the distant sound of something moving through the underbrush. "Should we build a fire?" Katie suggested. The campground had provided firewood, dry, split logs that caught easily and burned with a clean, bright flame. The circle of light pushed back the darkness and made us feel safer, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Tell us a story," Jen said, settling back in her camp chair. "Something scary. It's not a camping trip without ghost stories." I don't know any good ones, Katie protested. Everyone knows ghost stories. Come on, get us in the mood. So Katie told us about the vanishing hitchhiker, and Jen contributed the classic tale of the hook-handed killer. Standard campfire fare, but in this setting, they felt more real than usual. The darkness beyond our fire circle seemed to press closer with each tale, as if something out there was listening. When it was my turn, I found myself telling a story I'd never heard before, words flowing from some source I didn't recognize. It was about a place very much like where we sat, a valley where time moved differently and the boundaries between worlds grew thin, about campers who came seeking solitude and found something else entirely. Where did you hear that one? Jen asked when I finished. I frowned, trying to remember. I'm not sure. Maybe I read it somewhere. But even as I spoke, I knew that wasn't true. The story had come from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, and the way my friends were looking at me suggested they'd noticed something off about my telling of it. Around midnight, we finally let the fire die and retreated to the RV. The interior felt cramped after the open spaces outside, but also safer. Jen took the convertible dinette bed, Katie claimed the overcab bunk, and I settled into the rear bedroom. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I began to drift off, I'd hear sounds from outside. Footsteps circling the RV, voices whispering in a language I didn't recognize, the soft scratch of something dragging across the roof. Around 3 a.m, I gave up trying to sleep and crept to the front window. The campground lay bathed in moonlight, looking perfectly normal except for one detail that stopped my heart. Both of the other RVs, dark and apparently empty since our arrival, now showed lights in their windows. And silhouetted against those lights, I could see figures moving around. Not the normal movements of people settling in for the night, but something else. Something that flowed rather than walked, that seemed to shift and change shape as I watched. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the lights were gone. The RVs as dark as they'd been all day. Only the memory of those flowing shadows remained, burned into my retinas like an afterimage. The next morning brought relief in the form of bright sunshine and the smell of Katie's coffee brewing in the RV's small kitchen. Both she and Jen seemed well rested, showing no signs of the restless night I'd experienced. "Sleep okay?" Katie asked, handing me a steaming mug. "Like a baby," Jen added. "Something about the mountain air, I guess." I didn't mention the lights or the shadows. Maybe I had imagined them. The product of too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Maybe the isolation was already getting to me. We spent the morning exploring the immediate area around the campground, staying well clear of the marked trails. The valley was beautiful in daylight, with a small stream running through its center and meadows full of wildflowers that should have died with the first frost but somehow remained vibrant. "It's like a little piece of paradise," Katie said, taking photos with her now useless phone. "I could stay here forever." But Jen was less enchanted. "Does anything strike you as weird about this place?" she asked. "I mean, beyond the obvious isolation? Weird how? I don't know. The silence, maybe. Or the way that woman at the office looked at us." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Have either of you seen any animals? Birds, squirrels, even insects?" Now that she mentioned it, I realized I hadn't. The valley was beautiful but sterile, like a perfectly maintained garden where everything unwanted had been carefully removed. "Maybe it's the elevation," Katie suggested. "Or the time of year," but we all knew that wasn't right. Even in late autumn, there should have been something. Migrating birds at the very least, or the rustle of small mammals preparing for winter. That afternoon, despite our agreement to stick together, Jen announced she needed some alone time and set off on what appeared to be the shortest of the marked trails. Katie and I tried to talk her out of it, reminding her of Martha's warning about staying together, but she was adamant. "It's just a quick walk," she said. "I need to clear my head, and you two hovering isn't helping." She was back within an hour, but something had changed. The manic energy that normally defined Jen had been replaced by an unsettling calm. She moved more slowly, spoke more quietly, and had a distant look in her eyes that reminded me of people coming out of anesthesia. "How was your walk?" Katie asked. Peaceful, Jen replied, settling into her camp chair with that new, unnatural stillness. Really peaceful. You should try it. What did you see? Jen was quiet for a long moment, staring at something beyond the tree line. Old things, she said finally. Very old things. That evening, she insisted on cooking dinner alone, working at the camp stove with a precision that was completely unlike her usual chaotic style. The meal she produced was elaborate and delicious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was eating food prepared by a stranger. This is amazing, Katie said. Where did you learn to cook like this? Jen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You pick things up. After dinner, she suggested we build another fire, but this time she arranged the logs in a specific pattern, a complex geometric design that seemed to draw the eye inward. When the flames caught, they burned in colors I'd never seen before, shifting between blue and green and something that might have been silver. Beautiful, Katie murmured, and I realized she was staring into the flames with the same distant expression that had appeared on Jen's face. Katie, don't. But it was too late. My friend's eyes had taken on that glazed, dreamy quality, and when she spoke, her voice had the same flat effect that now characterized Jen's speech. We should all go for a walk, she said, into the woods. There are things to see. No, I said firmly. It's after dark. Martha warned us about going into the woods after dark. Both of my friends turned to look at me, and for a moment I saw something else looking back. Something ancient and hungry and definitely not human. Martha doesn't know everything, Jen said in that new, too calm voice. There are older rules here. Older truths. I stood up, backing away from the fire. What's wrong with you two? You're acting like completely different people. We're becoming who we were always meant to be, Katie said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. Who we were before the world taught us to be small and afraid. They began walking toward the tree line, moving in perfect synchronization. I called after them, begged them to stop, but they didn't even acknowledge my voice. Within moments, they had disappeared into the darkness between the trees. I was alone. My first instinct was to follow them, but every rational part of my mind screamed against it. Whatever had influenced my friends was in those woods, waiting. Instead, I retreated to the RV and locked every door and window, checking the latches twice. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I sat in the driver's seat, keys in the ignition, ready to leave at the first sign of real danger. But I couldn't abandon Katie and Jen, no matter how strangely they were acting. Around midnight, I heard them returning. Their voices drifted across the campground, speaking in that same unknown language I'd heard in my nightmares. But when they reached our site, they were alone, or at least they appeared to be alone. Rebecca, Katie called softly, come out. We have something to show you. I peered through the RV's small windows, trying to see them clearly in the moonlight. They stood just at the edge of the firelight, still moving with that eerie synchronization. But now they weren't alone. Other figures surrounded them. Tall, thin shapes that seemed to be made of shadow and moonlight. It's beautiful out here, Jen added. So peaceful. You should join us. The shadowy figures began to circle the RV, their movements creating no sound on the forest floor. Up close, I could see that they weren't entirely human. Too tall, joints bending in the wrong directions, faces that shifted and flowed like smoke. We know you're in there, one of them said, and its voice was the sound of wind through dead leaves. We can smell your fear. I crouched below the window level, heart pounding so hard I was certain they could hear it. The RV rocked slightly as something brushed against its side, and I heard the soft scrape of claws or fingernails against the aluminum walls. She'll come out eventually, Katie's voice said, though it no longer sounded like Katie at all. They always do. The sounds continued for hours. Circling footsteps, whispered conversations in that alien language, the occasional scratch against the RV's exterior. But as dawn approached, everything fell silent. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the campsite was empty except for the cold ashes of our fire. Katie and Jen were gone. I waited until full daylight before leaving the RV, searching the campsite for any sign of my friends. Their personal belongings were still there, clothes, toiletries, Katie's carefully organized camping supplies, but they had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. The trail they'd taken was clearly marked, leading into the same section of forest we'd explored on our first day. But now I could see things I'd missed before. Symbols carved into tree trunks, stones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and hanging from the branches, bits of fabric and personal items that might have belonged to other campers who had walked these paths and never returned. I followed the trail for less than 100 yards before my nerve broke. The forest felt alive with hostile intent, and every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. So I did. Back at the campsite, I threw our belongings into the RV with shaking hands, not bothering to organize or secure anything properly. The engine turned over on the first try, and I reversed out of the site without looking back. But the road that had brought us to Cedar Hollow was no longer there. Instead, I found myself driving through a maze of intersecting paths, each one leading deeper into the forest. Every turn brought me back to the same landmarks, the same twisted trees and moss-covered stones. I was trapped. For 3 hours I drove in circles, the fuel gauge dropping steadily as I searched for any path that led away from the valley. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent, and still I remained lost in the labyrinth of forest roads. Finally, in desperation, I stopped the RV and tried to think rationally. The campground had to have a real entrance, a connection to the outside world. I just had to find it. That's when I heard the singing. It was Katie's voice, clear and beautiful, carrying a melody I'd never heard before. It seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing off the trees until it surrounded me completely. "Come back to us, Rebecca," she sang. "Come home." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my skull. The melody was hypnotic, compelling, drawing me like a moth to flame. I found myself opening the RV door, one foot already on the step. "That's right," Jen's voice joined the song. "Just a few more steps." Through the trees, I could see them, my friends, dancing in a circle around one of those ancient pine trees, their movements flowing with inhuman grace. The shadowy figures from the night before danced with them, and as I watched, I realized that Katie and Jen were becoming like them, their forms growing taller and thinner with each revolution. "Join us," they sang in harmony. "Be free." I took another step forward, then another. The song was everything I'd ever wanted to hear, promising peace and belonging and an end to all the loneliness that had driven me to accept this camping trip in the first place. But something in my jacket pocket vibrated. My phone, receiving a text message despite the supposed lack of signal. I pulled it out with numb fingers and stared at the screen. The message was from Derek, my ex-boyfriend. "Hey babe, hope you're having fun camping with the girls. Drive safe. I love you." Derek had never called me babe. Derek definitely didn't love me, not after the way our relationship had ended. But seeing those words, even knowing they weren't real, broke the spell just enough for rational thought to return. This wasn't my phone. My phone was dead, had been since yesterday morning. This was someone else's device, programmed with messages designed to lure me deeper into whatever trap had claimed Katie and Jen. I threw the phone into the woods and ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. The singing continued, growing louder and more insistent, but I managed to start the engine and drive away from the sound. This time, I ignored the roads entirely. I drove straight through the forest, crashing through undergrowth and bouncing over fallen logs, following the compass on the RV's dashboard. Branches scraped against the windows and the undercarriage took a beating, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, I finally broke through the tree line and found myself on a paved road. A real road, with yellow lines and reflective markers and all the blessed normalcy of human civilization. I drove for another hour before I felt safe enough to stop, pulling into a gas station in a town whose name I didn't recognize. The attendant was a normal-looking teenager who confirmed that yes, this was New York, and yes, he could give me directions to the interstate. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said as I paid for gas. "Something like that," I replied. The police were even less helpful than the gas station attendant. I tried to file a missing persons report for Katie and Jen, but I had no idea where Cedar Hollow RV Resort was actually located. The coordinates from my GPS showed nothing but state forest land, and no business by that name appeared in any registry. "Are you sure about the name?" the officer asked. "Could it have been Cedar Point? Cedar Lake? There are several campgrounds in that area, but I was certain of the name, just as I was certain of what I'd seen. The problem was that certainty meant nothing without proof, and I had none to offer. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Another city person who'd gotten turned around in the woods and invented a story to explain their confusion. I never found Katie and Jen. The official investigation turned up nothing. The rental RV was returned with significant damage that cost me my entire security deposit. Katie's family hired a private investigator, but even he couldn't locate the campground I described. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the stress of my breakup with Derek and the pressures of work drove me to some kind of breakdown. The alternative, that my two best friends are still dancing in those dark woods, becoming something inhuman, is almost too horrible to contemplate. But late at night, when sleep won't come and the city feels too small and artificial, I can still hear their voices singing that impossible melody. And sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas on business trips, I'll see a dirt road leading into the forest that looks familiar, and I'll have to fight the urge to turn down it and find out if Cedar Hollow is still there, still waiting. Because part of me, the part that's tired of deadlines and rent payments and the grinding loneliness of modern life, still wants to join the dance, still wants to discover what Katie and Jen found in those ancient woods. The rational part of my mind knows that way lies madness. But on quiet nights when the wind sounds like singing, I'm not always sure which part of my mind is stronger. Last week I received a package with no return address. Inside was a wooden carving, one of those symbols I'd seen on the trail markers, along with a note written in Katie's handwriting. "The door is always open. Come home when you're ready." I threw both items away immediately, but I couldn't forget the way the carved symbol seemed to pulse with its own inner light, or how the note smelled of pine needles and something older, something that might have been eternity. They're still out there, waiting in the hollow places between the modern world and something far more ancient. And someday, when the weight of ordinary life becomes too much to bear, I might just answer their call. The invitation, after all, remains open. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from Mirror Lake. I'm Jennifer Martinez, and I was 29 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The RV was my father's idea of a retirement gift to himself, a gleaming 36-foot Winnebago that he'd barely used before the cancer took him 6 months later. Mom couldn't bear to look at it sitting in their driveway, so when I suggested taking it for a memorial trip to scatter his ashes somewhere beautiful, she practically threw the keys at me. "He would have loved that," she said, tears streaming down her face. He always talked about taking it to the Adirondacks, finding some perfect lake where he could fish and I could read. "Take Marcus with you? Your father always said that boy needed more wilderness in his life." Marcus Rodriguez had been my best friend since college, the kind of steady, reliable person who showed up when you called and asked questions later. At 32, he was 3 years older than me and infinitely more practical, which is probably why our friendship had survived a decade of my increasingly poor life choices. "You sure about this?" he asked as we loaded supplies into the RV outside my apartment in Brooklyn. "I mean, I'm all for honoring your dad's memory, but driving around upstate New York in November doesn't sound like the most therapeutic grief processing." "It's what he would have wanted," I insisted, though truthfully I had no idea what Dad would have wanted. We'd never been particularly close. His idea of father-daughter bonding was teaching me to change a tire and warning me about boys who rode motorcycles. But the RV felt like a connection to him somehow, the last remnant of dreams he'd never lived to fulfill. The interior still smelled like the cigars he'd quit smoking 20 years ago, and his fishing tackle remained neatly organized in the storage compartments. "Mirror Lake State Park," I announced, showing Marcus the reservation confirmation on my phone. Dad had this place bookmarked on every camping website he visited. It must have meant something to him. Marcus studied the photos on the screen. Pristine water surrounded by autumn foliage. Empty campsites nestled among towering pines. Looks peaceful enough. How far north are we talking? About 6 hours. Deep in the Adirondacks, near the Canadian border. The website says it's one of the most remote state parks in New York. What the website didn't mention, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Mirror Lake State Park had been closed for renovations since 2018. The reservation system I'd used belonged to a private campground that had apparently borrowed the name and copied the photos from the defunct state facility. We left Friday morning, taking I-87 north through the Hudson Valley as winter's first snow began to dust the mountains. Marcus drove while I navigated, using the printed directions that had come with our confirmation email. Neither of our phones showed any cell signal once we passed Lake George, and the GPS seemed confused by our destination. Turn left at the burned barn. I read aloud from the instructions. Follow the dirt road for 12 miles until you reach the stone bridge. Burned barn? Marcus squinted through the windshield at the increasingly rural landscape. That's oddly specific. We found it eventually. The blackened skeleton of what had once been a large dairy barn, standing in a field of dead grass like a monument to some forgotten tragedy. The dirt road beyond it was barely wide enough for the RV, forcing Marcus to creep along at 15 miles per hour while tree branches scraped against the roof. "This better be worth it," he muttered, wrestling with the steering wheel as we bounced through a series of deep potholes. "Your dad's suspension is taking a beating." The stone bridge appeared exactly where the directions promised. A narrow single-lane span over a creek that ran black as oil between snow-covered banks. Beyond it, the road deteriorated further, becoming little more than twin ruts through the forest. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Marcus asked. "This doesn't look like it leads to a state park." But I was committed now, driven by something deeper than logic. The urn containing Dad's ashes sat secured in the passenger seat, and I could almost feel his presence urging me forward. "Just a little further," I said. The website promised complete wilderness isolation. Mirror Lake appeared suddenly, opening before us like a dark mirror set among the pines. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the overcast sky so perfectly that it was impossible to tell where the lake ended and the heavens began. A small cluster of RV sites lined the near shore, connected by gravel roads that looked recently maintained. "Okay, that's actually beautiful," Marcus admitted as we pulled into the campground entrance. "Your dad had good taste." The office was a small log cabin that looked like it had been built in the 1940s and carefully maintained ever since. Smoke rose from its chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows in a way that felt genuinely welcoming after hours of driving through empty forest. A bell chimed as we entered, and a man emerged from a back room wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. "You must be Martinez," he said with a genuine smile. "I'm Robert Chen, the campground manager. Welcome to Mirror Lake." "Beautiful place," I said, accepting the registration paperwork. "My father had it bookmarked for years. I'm surprised more people don't know about it." Robert's expression flickered, just for a moment, before returning to its friendly warmth. "We prefer to keep things quiet. Maintain the wilderness experience, you know? No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no distractions from what really matters." He provided us with a detailed map of the campground and surrounding trails, along with a list of rules that seemed reasonable enough. No loud music after 9 p.m., no generators after 10. Stay on marked trails, observe fire restrictions. One thing, he added as we prepared to leave, the lake has some unusual properties. Something about the mineral content and the depth. It creates optical illusions, especially around dawn and dusk. People sometimes see things that aren't there. "What kind of things?" Marcus asked. "Oh, you know. Lights under the water, movement on the far shore when there's nothing there. The mind plays tricks when you're surrounded by this much wilderness." Robert's smile never wavered. "Just remember that if you see something that doesn't make sense, it's probably just the lake playing games." We found our assigned site easily enough. Spot number 7, right at the water's edge with an unobstructed view across the lake's dark surface. Only 2 other RVs were visible. both at the far end of the campground and showing no signs of occupancy. "Guess we have the place mostly to ourselves," Marcus observed as we set up camp. The process was surprisingly smooth. Dad had equipped the RV with all the latest conveniences, and within an hour we had power, water, and a level site. I spent the afternoon organizing Dad's fishing gear, planning to scatter his ashes from his favorite spot at the end of the dock. But as evening approached, something about the lake began to feel wrong. The water remained too still, like glass that had never been disturbed by wind or current. "You notice anything weird about this place?" Marcus asked as we prepared dinner on the camp stove. "Weird how?" "The silence. We've been here 4 hours and I haven't heard a single bird, or seen any wildlife. Even the bugs seem to be avoiding the area." Now that he mentioned it, the absence of natural sounds was unsettling. No loons calling across the water, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, not even the splash of fish jumping. Just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles and the gentle lap of water against the shore. "Maybe it's the season," I suggested. "Everything's probably preparing for winter." But even as I spoke, I noticed other oddities. The trees around the campground were all the same species, massive white pines that looked ancient, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter. In the growing twilight, they formed a perfect circle around the lake, like monuments marking some vast outdoor temple. We ate dinner as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected perfectly in the lake's mirror surface. It should have been peaceful, but instead I felt increasingly anxious, as if we were being watched by unseen eyes. "Tell me about your dad," Marcus said, clearly trying to distract me from my growing unease. "What made him choose this place?" I pulled out the urn, running my fingers over the smooth bronze surface. He never talked about it specifically, but after Mom showed me his computer history, I found dozens of searches for Mirror Lake Adirondacks. He'd bookmarked camping sites, fishing reports, even some historical articles about the area. "What kind of history?" "Logging, mostly. The whole region was clear-cut in the late 1800s, then left to regrow. But there were some older stories, too. Native American legends about the lake being a sacred site, a place where the spirit world touched our reality." Marcus poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "Your dad wasn't usually interested in that kind of mystical stuff." "No, he wasn't, which makes it even stranger. The last website he visited was about something called the Mirror Lake Incident from 1952. A family camping here just disappeared. Parents, 2 kids, and their dog. They found the campsite intact, food still cooking on the stove, but no trace of the people. Probably just got lost in the woods. Happens all the time." But even as he said it, Marcus's voice carried a note of uncertainty. The forest around us felt too vast, too empty, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. As full darkness fell, we moved closer to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to extend far beyond their actual reach, and several times I caught myself looking over my shoulder, certain I'd glimpsed movement among the trees. "We should scatter Dad's ashes tomorrow morning," I said, "from the dock, when the light is best." Sounds perfect. He would have loved this place, but would he have? The more time I spent at Mirror Lake, the more I questioned Dad's apparent obsession with it. He'd been the most practical man I'd ever known, a retired accountant who planned every vacation with military precision. What had drawn him to this remote, unsettling place? Around midnight, we finally let the fire die and retreated to the RV. Marcus took the convertible dinette bed while I claimed the master bedroom in the rear. But sleep proved elusive. Every time I began to drift off, I'd hear sounds from outside that didn't quite make sense. Footsteps circling the RV. Voices whispering in a language I didn't recognize. The soft splash of something large moving through the water. Twice I got up to look out the windows, but the campground appeared empty, bathed in moonlight that turned everything silver and strange. The lake's surface remained perfectly still, reflecting stars that seemed brighter and more numerous than they should have been. The third time I heard the footsteps, I noticed they had a rhythm. Not the random pace of someone walking, but something deliberate, ceremonial, like a dance or a ritual. I crept to the front of the RV and gently shook Marcus awake. "Do you hear that?" He sat up, instantly alert. "Hear what?" But the sounds had stopped, leaving only the normal whisper of wind through the pines. Marcus listened for several minutes before shaking his head. "Nothing out there, Jen. Maybe you're just processing grief in weird ways. First night in a new place, strange surroundings. It's normal to be on edge." He was probably right. I was letting the isolation and my emotional state create problems that didn't exist. But as I returned to the bedroom, I could have sworn I saw a face looking back at me from the lake's surface. Pale, distorted, definitely not my own reflection. Dawn brought relief in the form of bright sunshine and the smell of Marcus's coffee brewing. I felt foolish about my midnight paranoia as we prepared breakfast and discussed our plans for the day. "I was thinking we could take the ashes out on the lake," I said, studying Dad's fishing gear. "He had a small boat motor in the storage compartment. There's supposed to be a launch ramp on the north side." "Sounds good. We can explore the area, maybe do some hiking afterward." But when we walked down to investigate the boat launch, we found the dock in a state of severe disrepair. Half the planks were missing, and those that remained looked like they'd rot through if anyone tried to walk on them. "That's weird," Marcus said. "Robert mentioned the facilities were well maintained." We returned to the office to ask about alternate options, but found it locked with a note on the door. "Gone fishing. Back later. R." Gone fishing where? I wondered aloud. We're the only people here. Marcus shrugged. Maybe he has a secret spot. "Let's walk around the lake, find a good place to do the ceremony from shore." The trail that circled Mirror Lake was well marked and appeared to be regularly maintained, unlike the deteriorating dock. We followed it clockwise, stopping frequently to admire the view and look for a suitable location to scatter Dad's ashes. But as we walked, I began to notice disturbing details. The trees along the shoreline all bore scars, deep gouges in the bark that looked fresh despite the obvious age of the wounds. Some of the markings resembled symbols, though I couldn't read their meaning. "Look at this," Marcus called from a few yards ahead. He was standing beside a metal plaque mounted on a stone cairn. "It's some kind of memorial." I joined him and read the inscription. "In memory of the Chen family, Robert, Lisa, and children, Michael and Sarah, lost to Mirror Lake, August 15, 1952. Their spirits remain with us always." "Chen," I said slowly, like the guy who checked us in. Probably a relative. Common enough name. But the dates bothered me. 1952 was the year of the Mirror Lake incident I'd read about online. The family that had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their abandoned campsite. We continued around the lake, finding 2 more memorial plaques. The Morrison family, lost in 1967. The Blackwood family, lost in 1983. All of them bearing the same ominous phrase, "Their spirits remain with us always." "This is getting creepy," Marcus said after we discovered the 4th memorial. "How many people have disappeared from this place? Maybe we should ask Robert when he gets back." But Robert was nowhere to be found when we returned to the campground office. His truck was gone, and the building showed no signs of recent occupancy despite the warm light we'd seen the night before. "I don't like this," Marcus said, checking his phone for the 100th time. Still, no signal. If something goes wrong out here, we're completely cut off. I was beginning to share his unease, but we'd come too far to turn back now. "Let's scatter Dad's ashes this afternoon, then leave first thing in the morning." We spent the rest of the day exploring the immediate area around our campsite, staying well away from the forest trails that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. The lake itself remained perfectly still, its surface so reflective that it was often difficult to distinguish between the real sky and its watery twin. As afternoon faded toward evening, I finally worked up the courage to approach the water's edge with Dad's urn. The plan was simple. Scatter his ashes from the small beach beside our campsite, say a few words, and let him become part of the wilderness he'd loved. But as I unscrewed the urn's lid, something in the water caught my eye. A ripple, perfectly circular, spreading outward from a point about 50 feet from shore. As I watched, more ripples appeared, creating a pattern of concentric circles that seemed too regular to be natural. "Marcus, look at this." He joined me at the water's edge, following my gaze. "Probably just fish. Even if we can't see them, there's got to be life in the lake." But as we watched, the ripples began to form more complex patterns, spirals and geometric shapes that definitely weren't caused by fish. Something was moving beneath the surface, something large and deliberate. "The hell with this," Marcus said. "Let's get out of here. Wait." I opened the urn, determined to complete the ceremony despite my growing fear. This is what Dad wanted. I began to pour the ashes into the water, speaking the words I'd rehearsed about love and memory and letting go. But as the gray powder touched the lake's surface, something extraordinary happened. The water began to glow. Not the harsh artificial glow of electric lights, but something softer, more organic. It started where the ashes had fallen and spread outward like phosphorescent paint, turning the entire lake into a mirror of stars. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered. "What is that?" But I couldn't answer, because something was rising from the depths, a shape that might have been human, walking up from the bottom of the lake as if climbing an underwater staircase. As it approached the surface, I could make out details. A middle-aged man in fishing clothes, his face pale but unmistakably familiar. "Dad?" The word came out as barely a whisper. The figure broke the surface without creating a single ripple, water streaming from its form like liquid light. When it spoke, I heard Dad's voice exactly as I remembered it, warm and slightly amused. "Jenny, you found it. You found the place." "Dad, what are you doing here? You're dead. I have your ashes." He smiled, the same gentle expression I remembered from childhood. "Death is just another country, sweetheart, and this lake is the border crossing." More figures were rising from the depths now. Entire families, dozens of people spanning multiple generations. I recognized faces from the memorial plaques, but there were others too, strangers who looked at me with expressions of infinite sadness and longing. "We've been waiting," Dad continued. "All of us, waiting for someone to understand what this place really is." "I don't understand anything," I said, backing away from the water's edge. "This isn't real. You're dead." "Am I?" He took a step onto the shore, leaving no footprints in the sand. "Or am I more alive than I've ever been? Look around you, Jenny. Really look." Against my better judgment, I did. The campground was transforming. Buildings that had looked rustic but well-maintained revealing their true state of decay. Our RV sat rusted and partially collapsed, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Even the trees looked different. Older, more gnarled, their branches reaching toward the glowing lake like supplicants before an altar. "It's a gateway," Dad explained, his voice growing fainter as if he was speaking from a great distance. "A place where time moves differently, where the boundaries between worlds are thin. I've been researching it for years, trying to understand. Researching what? How to cross over? How to find the door between life and death?" His form was becoming translucent, barely more solid than moonlight on water. "I had cancer, Jenny. Terminal, aggressive, no hope of recovery. But I found this place, and I found a way." Marcus grabbed my arm, trying to pull me away from the water. "Jen, we need to leave. Now." But I couldn't move, transfixed by the sight of my father standing impossible before me. "You killed yourself. You came here, and you killed yourself." "I chose my own ending," he corrected gently. "Instead of wasting away in a hospital bed, I chose to become part of something larger, something eternal." The other figures from the lake were surrounding us now, their pale faces reflecting the water's phosphorescent glow. They moved without sound, gliding across the sand like a congregation of ghosts. "Join us," Dad said, extending his hand. "The water is warm here, Jenny, peaceful. All your pain, all your loneliness, it can end." For a moment, I was tempted. The isolation of my life in Brooklyn, the endless cycle of work and bills and empty relationships, what was the point of any of it? Here was peace. Here was belonging. Here was reunion with the father I'd barely known in life, but who seemed to understand me perfectly in death. I took a step toward the water. "Jen, no." Marcus's voice broke the spell. Look at them. Really look. I blinked, and for just a moment saw the truth behind the beautiful illusion. The figures surrounding us weren't peaceful spirits. They were corpses, bloated and decomposing, their pale glow coming from bioluminescent bacteria feeding on rotting flesh. The man I'd thought was my father was just another victim, his face eaten away by fish and time. "It's not real," I whispered, stumbling backward. "None of this is real." But even as I spoke, part of me wanted to believe. The loneliness was real. The pain was real. And the promise of ending it all, of finding peace in the glowing depths, remained seductive. Marcus was pulling me toward the RV, but the vehicle was changing too, revealing its true state of decay. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the interior was filled with black water that smelled of death and rotting vegetation. "The keys," I gasped. "Where are the keys?" But there were no keys, just as there was no working RV, no campground office, no helpful manager named Robert Chen. It had all been illusion, a trap designed to lure people to their deaths in the lake's phosphorescent depths. The ghostly figures were closing in, their movements becoming more aggressive as they realized we were resisting their call. Dad's face twisted into something hungry and desperate, all pretense of parental love stripped away. "You can't leave," he said, his voice now echoing with the sound of drowning. "No one leaves Mirror Lake. We won't let you." Marcus grabbed a piece of broken metal from the rusted RV and swung it at the nearest spirit. The improvised weapon passed harmlessly through the translucent form, but the motion seemed to disrupt its cohesion, causing it to flicker and fade. "They're not solid," he shouted. "They can't actually touch us. Run!" We ran toward the forest, crashing through underbrush that tore at our clothes and skin. Behind us, the lake erupted with inhuman voices, dozens of drowned souls crying out in rage and hunger. The trees were different too, revealing their true nature as we fled. What had looked like healthy pines were actually hollow shells, their bark worn smooth by decades of wind and weather. Some had collapsed entirely, creating a maze of fallen trunks that we had to navigate by moonlight. "Which way?" Marcus gasped as we reached a fork in what might once have been a trail. I tried to remember the route we'd taken to reach the lake, but the landscape had changed completely. Where there had been a dirt road, now there was only wilderness. The stone bridge was gone, along with any other landmarks that might have guided us back to civilization. "I don't know," I admitted. "Everything looks different." We chose a direction at random and kept running, driven by the sound of pursuit echoing through the forest. Not footsteps. The dead don't walk on solid ground, but something worse. The sound of water flowing uphill, of streams reversing their course to follow us inland. For hours we stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the faint glow of dawn beginning to show between the trees. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded, but neither of us dared to stop and rest. Finally, as the sun crested the eastern mountains, we emerged from the forest onto a paved road. A real road with yellow lines and reflective markers and the blessed promise of human civilization. A state trooper found us an hour later, exhausted and hypothermic, wandering along Route 30 with no clear memory of how we'd gotten there. We tried to tell him about Mirror Lake, about the campground and the glowing water and the dead walking among the living. He was patient but skeptical, the way cops are when dealing with people who've obviously suffered some kind of trauma. According to his maps, there was no Mirror Lake in that area, no campground matching our description. "You probably got turned around in the state forest," he suggested. "Happens all the time. These woods can be confusing, especially at night." The official investigation found nothing. The rental RV we'd supposedly driven was discovered abandoned in a parking lot in Albany, showing no signs of recent use. Security footage from the rental agency showed me picking up the vehicle alone, with no companion matching Marcus's description. "Are you sure your friend was with you?" the detective asked. "Sometimes people in crisis create imaginary companions to help them cope with traumatic situations. But Marcus was real. He sat beside me in the police station, answering their questions with increasing frustration as they treated him like a figment of my imagination." Either he was the most elaborate hallucination in psychiatric history, or something at Mirror Lake had the power to edit reality itself. The search for Dad's ashes turned up nothing. According to the funeral home's records, I'd picked up the urn 3 days earlier and signed paperwork indicating I would scatter them privately. But when they opened the urn, it was empty except for a small amount of lake water that smelled of decay. "Could you have scattered them already?" the funeral director asked gently. "Sometimes grief causes memory gaps. It's more common than you might think." Maybe he was right. Maybe the stress of Dad's death had caused a complete psychological break, and everything I remembered about Mirror Lake was just my mind's way of processing loss and guilt. But if that's true, how do I explain the photographs? They appeared on my phone a week after I returned to Brooklyn. Dozens of images I had no memory of taking. Pictures of Dad sitting in the RV, smiling and alive. Pictures of a beautiful lakeside campground that looked nothing like the decaying nightmare I remembered. Pictures of Marcus and me having the perfect memorial weekend I'd originally planned. In every photo, we looked happy, peaceful, like people who had found exactly what they were looking for. The last image was a selfie, taken at what appeared to be sunset over the lake. Dad stood behind Marcus and me, his hands on our shoulders, all three of us grinning at the camera. But if you look closely at our reflections in the water, something is wrong. In the reflection, we're not smiling. In the reflection, our eyes are black as lake water at midnight. And behind us, barely visible in the photograph's digital shadows, stands a crowd of pale figures reaching toward the camera with waterlogged hands. I've never shown that picture to anyone. I've never told anyone about the dreams that started after I returned to the city. Dreams where I'm standing waist-deep in phosphorescent water, surrounded by the voices of the drowned, all of them calling my name. Sometimes I wake up with wet footprints leading from my bedroom door to the bathroom sink. Sometimes I catch myself researching driving directions to places that don't officially exist. My browser history filled with searches for Mirror Lake Adirondacks and how to find the door between worlds. Marcus says I'm processing grief in unhealthy ways. He's probably right when he's actually there, when he's not flickering like bad reception or speaking with a voice that echoes like words spoken underwater. Because that's the thing about Mirror Lake. Once you've been there, once you've seen the truth about the boundaries between life and death, you never really leave. Part of you remains in those phosphorescent depths, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and the loneliness feels like drowning, I can hear Dad calling to me across impossible distances. His voice carries promises of peace and reunion, and an end to all the pain that comes with being alive. The invitation, after all, remains open. All I have to do is find my way back to the lake. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's David Anderson. I just turned 34 when we arrived at the Adirondacks. And it was the worst mistake of our lives. The RV park wasn't on any official map. Sarah found it through some obscure camping forum, buried deep in a thread about hidden gems in upstate New York. The photos showed pristine lakefront sites nestled between towering pines, and the price was too good to pass up, $50 a night for a premium waterfront spot. "It's called Whispering Pines," she'd said, showing me her laptop screen. "Look at this place, Dave. It's perfect." I should have asked why it was so cheap. I should have wondered why there were no reviews, no Google listings, no official website. But Sarah had been through hell that year. Her father's death, the layoffs at her marketing firm, the miscarriage we still couldn't talk about. She needed this trip. We both did. Our marriage had been hanging by threads for months. The grief counselor said a change of scenery might help us reconnect, find our way back to each other. So when Sarah's eyes lit up for the first time in months while looking at those photos, I booked 3 nights without hesitation. The drive north from Albany took longer than expected. My GPS lost signal after we turned off Route 9, and Sarah's phone showed nothing but blank green space. We navigated by the handwritten directions the campground owner had emailed. Turn left at the weathered barn, right at the stone bridge, follow the dirt road for 6 miles. Maybe we should turn around, I said as our 30-foot Winnebago bounced along the increasingly narrow path. Ancient pines pressed close on both sides, their branches scraping against the roof like fingernails on a coffin lid. "We're almost there," Sarah insisted, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She held the directions with white knuckles, squinting at the fading ink. "Besides, when's the last time we did something adventurous?" The forest felt wrong somehow. Too quiet, too still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves. Just the rumble of our diesel engine and the whisper of wind through the canopy above. Even in daylight, shadows pooled thick between the trees, impenetrable and waiting. We found whispering pines as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The entrance was marked by a simple wooden sign, paint peeling, and letters barely legible. Beyond it, a small clearing opened around a dark lake that reflected the sky like black glass. Only 3 other RVs occupied the campground, scattered around the shoreline with generous space between them. Ours would be the 4th, completing what felt like the points of some vast, invisible compass. A small office building sat near the entrance, dark windows staring out at the water. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, and I had to agree. Whatever my unease about the journey, the place itself was stunning. Pristine wilderness untouched by development. The kind of hidden sanctuary every camper dreams of finding. We backed our RV into Site 7, right at the water's edge. The process took longer than usual. My hands felt clumsy on the wheel, and twice I had to pull forward and readjust. Sarah guided me with increasingly agitated hand signals until finally we were level and connected to the campground's utilities. "I'm going to check us in," I said, nodding toward the office. "Want me to come?" "Nah, start getting us set up. I'll be right back." The office door stood slightly ajar despite the evening chill. I knocked and pushed it open, calling out a greeting. The interior was dim and smelled of dust and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit. "Help you?" I spun around. A thin man stood behind the counter, though I was certain the space had been empty moments before. He was perhaps 60, with paper-white skin and colorless eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. "David Anderson, I made a reservation." He nodded slowly and pulled out a leather-bound register, the kind you might find in a Victorian hotel. His fingers were long and pale as he flipped through yellowed pages. "Site 7, 3 nights." His voice was barely above a whisper. "That'll be $150, cash only." I handed over the bills, noticing how cold his fingers felt when they brushed mine. "Nice place you have here, very secluded. Privacy is what we offer." He closed the register with a soft thud. "Few rules to keep in mind. Quiet hours begin at sunset. No fires after midnight. Stay on the designated trails." His colorless gaze fixed on mine. "And don't go out on the lake after dark." "Any particular reason?" Something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Folks who do tend to get turned around. Water plays tricks in the moonlight." I thanked him and headed back to the RV, but his words lingered. There had been something in his tone, a weight that suggested more than simple navigation concerns. Sarah had already deployed our awning and was setting up camp chairs by the water's edge. The other RVs remained dark and silent, no signs of their occupants. For all we could tell, we had the place to ourselves. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Fine. Guy's a little odd, but the price was right." I didn't mention the warnings about the lake. Sarah was already scanning the dark water with barely concealed longing. We spent our first evening quietly, cooking dinner on the portable grill and watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in months, Sarah seemed genuinely relaxed. She even laughed at one of my terrible jokes, the sound carrying across the still water like a bell. "I needed this," she said, taking my hand as stars began to emerge overhead. "I needed us to remember what we used to be. What we still are," I corrected, squeezing her fingers. "We just lost our way for a while." But even as I spoke the words, I felt eyes watching from the dark tree line. When I turned to look, there was nothing there except shadows that seemed to shift and breathe in the corner of my vision. We went to bed early, exhausted from the long drive. Our RV felt smaller in the wilderness silence, every creak and settle magnified by the absolute quiet outside. Sarah fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake listening to the gentle lap of water against the shore and something else, a sound I couldn't quite identify. Whispering. It was so faint I wasn't sure it was real. Voices carrying across the water, too distant to understand, but definitely human. I slipped out of bed and peered through the window, but the lake stretched black and empty under a thin crescent moon. Probably just the wind, I told myself. Places like this played tricks on the mind. But as I finally drifted off, I could have sworn I heard someone calling Sarah's name. I woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and the smell of coffee brewing in our kitchen. Sarah stood at the stove, already dressed and alert, humming softly to herself. "Morning, sunshine," she said without turning around. "Sleep well?" "Like the dead." I sat up, noting that her side of the bed was cold. "You've been up for a while." "Couldn't sleep. Went for a walk around 5. Something in her tone made me pause. "A walk? Where?" "Just around the campground. It's incredible in the early morning. The mist coming off the water, the way the light filters through the trees." She handed me a steaming mug. "I saw our neighbors, too. Nice family." I looked out the window toward the other RVs. They still appeared empty, windows dark despite the morning sun. "You talked to them?" "Just briefly. They were heading out to fish." Sarah's eyes had a distant quality, as if she was seeing something beyond the present moment. "They've been coming here for years. They say the lake has stories." "What kind of stories?" She shrugged, but her smile seemed different somehow. Wider than usual, lasting a beat too long. "Old stories, Indian legends about spirits in the water, the kind of thing that adds character to a place." We spent the morning exploring the area around our site. The campground was larger than it had appeared the night before, with trails winding back into the deep woods. Every path was marked with small wooden signs bearing symbols I didn't recognize. Not standard Park Service markers, but crude carvings that looked handmade. The other RVs remained silent and apparently empty, though fresh tire tracks in the dirt suggested recent movement. I mentioned this to Sarah, but she seemed unconcerned. "People come and go," she said. "It's not a resort, Dave. It's wilderness camping." But I'd been wilderness camping before, and there was something off about whispering pines. The silence was too complete, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines that gave the place its name. No insects, no bird calls, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the normal soundtrack of nature had been muted. Around noon, we decided to take our kayaks out on the lake. Sarah had been eyeing the water all morning with increasing intensity, and I thought some activity might settle my growing unease. "Remember what the manager said about not going out after dark?" I mentioned as we carried the boats to the shore. Sarah paused, paddle in hand. "Did he? I don't remember that. Last night when I checked in, he specifically warned against going on the water after sunset." She stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Probably liability concerns. People getting lost in the dark, that sort of thing." We launched the kayaks into water so still it might have been glass. The lake was larger than it appeared from shore, stretching back into narrow channels between forested peninsulas. We paddled slowly, staying close to the shoreline, but Sarah kept looking toward the deeper water in the center. "How deep do you think it is?" she asked. "No idea. Could be hundreds of feet. These Adirondack lakes can be deceptively deep. I wonder what's down there." Something in her voice made me look over. She had stopped paddling and was staring into the dark water beside her kayak. "Sarah, can you see them?" "See what?" "The lights. Deep down, like stars fallen into the water." I leaned over the side of my kayak, peering into the black depths. Nothing but my own reflection stared back. "I don't see anything." But Sarah continued to gaze downward, mesmerized. "They're beautiful, like tiny suns burning in the deep." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Sarah, let's head back." She blinked as if waking from a trance. "What?" "Oh yes, of course." But she cast one last longing look at the water before following me back to shore. That afternoon brought our first encounter with other campers. A man emerged from the RV at Site 3 as we were grilling lunch, walking over with the casual friendliness common among fellow travelers. "Afternoon," he called. "Tom Bradley. My wife, Diane, and I are at Site 3. I introduced ourselves, grateful for normal human contact. Tom was perhaps 50, with the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. But when I looked into his eyes, I felt the same unease I'd experienced with the campground manager. "Beautiful place," I said. "Very peaceful." "Oh, yes," Tom agreed. "We've been coming here for—" He paused, seeming to calculate. "Well, seems like forever now. Wouldn't dream of going anywhere else." "How long have you been here this trip?" Again that pause. "Hard to say. Days blend together out here. That's part of the charm." Tom's wife, Diane, joined us, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and the same distant look in her eyes that I'd noticed in Sarah that morning. She smiled constantly, but it never reached her eyes. "We were just telling your wife about the lake," Diane said. "The stories it holds." "What kind of stories?" I asked. "Old ones," Tom said. "The Mohawk used to consider this a sacred place, said the water was a gateway to the spirit world." He gestured toward the dark surface. "Course, that was before the loggers came through in the 1800s. "Loggers? Big operation. Clear-cut most of the old growth, built a mill right where the office sits now." Diane's smile never wavered. "Employed half the county for nearly 20 years. "What happened to it?" Tom and Diane exchanged a look. "Accident," Tom said finally. "Mill caught fire one winter night. 37 men inside, working the night shift." His voice took on the cadence of an often-told story. "Blaze spread so fast none of them got out. Burned for 3 days before the flames died down. Local folks say you can still hear them sometimes," Diane added. "Calling out across the water on quiet nights." Sarah had been listening intently. "That's terrible. Were their bodies ever recovered?" "Never found," Tom said. "Lake took them all, along with what was left of the mill. Bottom dropped out after the fire, they say. Whole structure just sank." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "When did this happen?" "Oh, long time ago now. 1847, I think it was. Or maybe 48. Tom's eyes grew distant. "Time gets funny out here. Past and present seem to blend together like mist on the water." After they left, I felt more unsettled than ever. Sarah, however, seemed energized by the conversation. "Fascinating history," she said. "No wonder the place feels so atmospheric." "Atmospheric?" "Sarah, 37 people died here. That was over 150 years ago, Dave. It's history now, part of what makes the place special." But I couldn't shake the feeling that those deaths weren't as distant as she believed. The silence that surrounded us felt expectant, waiting, and twice that afternoon I caught myself looking toward the lake, certain I'd glimpsed movement beneath the surface. As evening approached, Sarah suggested a walk along the shoreline. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the growing twilight, the lake looked almost black. "It's so peaceful," Sarah said, her voice dreamy. "I could stay here forever. It's only 3 days, hon. We'll be heading home Sunday morning." She stopped walking and turned to face the water. "Maybe we could extend our stay. The manager seems flexible." "We can't. You know I have that presentation Monday, and you have the interview at—" "Those things don't matter," she interrupted, still staring at the lake. "Nothing matters except this place. Can't you feel it, Dave? The peace? The rightness of being here?" I studied her profile in the fading light. Something was different about her face, though I couldn't pinpoint what. The angles seemed sharper somehow, the shadows deeper. "Sarah, are you feeling okay?" She turned to me with that too wide smile. "I feel wonderful, better than I have in months. This place is healing us, Dave. Can't you see that?" A sound drifted across the water, faint but unmistakably human voices. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound like a hunting dog catching a scent. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. The voices were clearer now, multiple speakers calling out in what might have been distress or celebration. It was impossible to tell which. "Probably our neighbors," I said. "Sound carries over water." But even as I spoke, I could see Tom and Diane's RV in my peripheral vision, dark and silent at Site 3. Sarah had begun walking toward the water's edge. "They're calling to us." "Sarah, stop." I caught her arm. "Remember what the manager said about staying away from the lake after dark." She looked at me with confusion, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "He didn't say that." "Yes, he did. Last night when I checked in." "You're wrong." Her voice was flat, certain. "He never said anything about the lake." I stared at her, searching for signs of the woman I'd married. But the Sarah looking back at me was subtly different. Still recognizable, but somehow changed, like a photograph that had been slightly overexposed. The voices across the water grew louder, more insistent. Now I could make out individual words, though they seemed to be in some language I didn't recognize. Sarah swayed slightly, as if in rhythm to music only she could hear. "We should go back to the RV," I said. "In a minute." She pulled free of my grip and took another step toward the water. "They're trying to tell us something important." The rational part of my mind insisted that what I was hearing was wind through the trees, perhaps the distant sound of traffic on some unseen road. But my body knew better. Every instinct screamed danger, the same primal warning that had kept our ancestors alive when predators stalked the night. "Sarah, please, let's go back." She finally turned away from the water, but reluctantly, like someone leaving a party just as it was getting interesting. "Fine, but we're coming back tomorrow night. I need to understand what they're saying." We walked back to the RV in silence, but I could feel her tension, the way she kept looking over her shoulder toward the lake. Once we were inside with the door locked, I felt marginally safer. "I'm going to call and check our messages," I said, pulling out my cell phone. But there was no signal. Not even one bar. "Must be the mountains," Sarah said. She was standing at the kitchen window staring out at the water. "Did you know there are theories about certain locations acting as gateways?" "Gateways to what?" "Other dimensions, other times, places where the boundary between worlds grows thin." She spoke without looking away from the window. "Indigenous peoples often recognize these spots, considered them sacred." "Sarah, what's gotten into you? Yesterday you were making jokes about my terrible driving, and now you're talking like you're writing a dissertation on paranormal phenomena." She turned to me with that unsettling smile. "Maybe I'm finally opening my mind to possibilities I never considered before. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Grow? Change?" I wanted to argue, but the words died in my throat. Because she was right, in a way. We had come here hoping to change, to find our way back to each other. But this wasn't the kind of change I'd had in mind. We ate dinner in relative quiet, though Sarah kept glancing toward the windows. As night deepened, the RV felt increasingly isolated, despite the other campers around the lake. No lights showed in their windows, no sounds of normal evening activities. "I'm going to turn in early," I said around 9 o'clock. "Long day tomorrow?" Sarah nodded absently. "I'll be along in a bit. I want to read for a while." I found a paperback thriller in the bedroom and tried to lose myself in its familiar rhythms. But the words kept blurring together. Every few minutes I'd catch myself listening for sounds from outside, footsteps, voices, anything to indicate we weren't completely alone. Around 11, I heard the soft sound of our door opening. "Sarah!" I called out. No answer. I got up and padded to the front of the RV, but she wasn't there. The door stood slightly ajar, letting in the cool night air and the distant sound of lapping water. I stepped outside, pulling on a jacket. "Sarah!" She stood at the edge of the lake, still as a statue, her nightgown pale in the starlight. The voices were audible again, clearer than before, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Sarah, what are you doing?" She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I approached carefully, noting how she swayed slightly, as if influenced by some current I couldn't feel. "Come back inside. It's cold." Finally she turned, and in the moonlight I could see her face clearly. Her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface, like pools of dark water reflecting starlight. I stumbled backward. "What? They're so beautiful," she whispered, and her voice had a quality I'd never heard before, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "They want to show us their world. Sarah, you're scaring me." She blinked, and when her eyes opened, they were normal again, confused, frightened. "Dave, how did I get out here?" I took her arm, noting how cold her skin felt. "You were sleepwalking. Come on, let's get you inside." She allowed me to lead her back to the RV, but she kept looking over her shoulder toward the water. "I was dreaming," she said. "Such vivid dreams. There were people in the lake, Dave. They were trying to tell me something." Once inside, I locked the door and guided her to the couch. She sat heavily, shivering despite the warmth. "What did they say?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "They said," she frowned, concentrating. "They said they'd been waiting so long for someone to hear them, someone to help them find their way home. Home where? They didn't say, but they seemed so lost, so desperate." Tears began to flow down her cheeks. I wanted to help them. I held her until the shivering stopped, but sleep was impossible for both of us. Every time I began to drift off, I'd hear those voices calling across the water, and I'd have to check to make sure Sarah was still beside me. Dawn brought no relief. Sarah woke exhausted and disoriented with no clear memory of her midnight walk to the lake. She spent the morning sitting by the window, staring at the water with an expression I couldn't read. "Maybe we should leave early," I suggested over breakfast. "Get back to civilization." "Leave?" She turned to me with genuine shock. "Dave, we just got here. It's been 2 days." "Has it?" She seemed genuinely confused. "It feels like we just arrived." I was beginning to understand what Tom had meant about time getting funny. The hours seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably, and I found myself losing track of when things had happened. Had we arrived yesterday or a week ago? Had I been having this conversation with Sarah before? After lunch, I decided to explore the campground more thoroughly. Something was wrong here. Beyond my wife's strange behavior and the mysterious voices on the lake, the other RVs remained dark and silent despite clear evidence that people were present. Fresh footprints in the dirt, the occasional glimpse of a figure moving past a window. I started with Site 3, where Tom and Diane were supposedly staying. Up close, their RV showed signs of long-term occupancy. Rust stains, faded paint, tires that looked nearly bald. But when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. The same pattern repeated at Sites 4 and 6, RVs that appeared lived in but empty of people. It was as if the occupants existed only at specific moments, materializing just long enough to have brief conversations before fading back into whatever limbo they usually occupied. The trail system proved even more disturbing. The wooden signs I'd noticed earlier bore symbols that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. They seemed to shift and writhe, never quite the same from moment to moment. The paths themselves formed patterns that hurt to contemplate, geometric designs that folded in on themselves in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I followed one trail for what felt like miles, though the campground couldn't have been more than a few acres. It wound through increasingly dense forest, past trees that grew in perfect circles around empty clearings. In several spots I found evidence of old structures, foundation stones, rusted metal, fragments of machinery. The mill, I realized. These were remnants of the logging operation Tom had described. But if the mill had burned in 1847, why did some of the debris look so recent? I found pieces of metal that showed no rust, wood that looked freshly cut despite being scattered among century-old foundations. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing dominated by a single massive pine tree. Its trunk was easily 6 feet in diameter, and something about its presence felt ancient, predatory. The bark was scarred with the same writhing symbols I'd seen on the trail markers, carved deep into the living wood. At the base of the tree, partially hidden by fallen needles, I found a collection of personal items. Watches, jewelry, car keys, cell phones, all arranged in careful patterns around the enormous roots. Some looked decades old, others were clearly recent. A smartphone that couldn't have been more than a few months old sat next to a pocket watch that might have been Victorian. I picked up the phone, noting it was the same model Sarah carried. When I pressed the home button, it lit up to show dozens of missed calls from someone named Dave. My blood turned to ice water. With trembling fingers, I checked the contact list. My own name and number were there, along with Sarah's workplace, her sister, all the usual entries. But according to the phone's owner information, it belonged to Sarah Anderson. I scrolled through the photo gallery with growing horror. Pictures of our RV at Site 7. Pictures of me setting up camp. Pictures of Sarah standing by the lake, her eyes already beginning to show that distant, hungry look I'd learned to fear. The final photo was taken just hours ago. A selfie of Sarah standing exactly where I now stood, beneath the scarred pine tree. But in the image, her eyes were completely black, and her smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Behind her in the photo, barely visible among the shadows, stood dozens of figures. Men in the rough clothing of 19th century loggers, their faces pale and their eyes dark as lake water at midnight. I dropped the phone and ran. The trail seemed to shift beneath my feet, paths branching and merging in impossible ways. Several times I found myself running in circles, passing the same landmarks repeatedly despite never consciously changing direction. The forest grew darker as I ran, though the sun was still high overhead. Finally, gasping and disoriented, I stumbled back into the campground clearing. Our RV sat where we'd parked it, awning deployed and camp chairs arranged beside the water. Everything looked completely normal except for one detail that stopped my heart. Sarah stood waist-deep in the lake, her back to me, completely motionless. "Sarah!" I ran toward the water's edge but stopped short when she began to turn. The movement was wrong. Too slow, too mechanical, like a marionette being manipulated by an unskilled puppeteer. When she faced me fully, I saw that her eyes were black again, but this time they remained that way. And her smile revealed far too many teeth, needle-sharp and glistening. "Dave," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. "I've been waiting for you. Sarah, get out of the water, please. But I like it here. We all do." She gestured, and I noticed for the first time that the lake was full of figures. Dozens of people standing in the dark water, their pale faces turned toward me with identical black-eyed stares. Tom and Diane were there, along with other campers I didn't recognize. And scattered among them, barely visible beneath the surface, I could make out the shapes of older figures. Men in work clothes, their faces bearing the gaunt look of those who had died by fire. "This is where we belong," Sarah continued. "Where we've always belonged. The boundaries are so thin here, Dave. Past and present, living and dead, real and unreal. Everything flows together like water." I backed away from the shore. "You're not Sarah." Her inhuman smile widened. "I'm more Sarah than she ever was. I'm Sarah without fear, without doubt, without the petty concerns that kept her from embracing what this place offers." She took a step toward shore, water streaming from her nightgown. "Join us, Dave. Let the lake wash away everything that hurts." Other figures began moving toward the shore as well, their movements creating no splash, no ripple. They glided through the water like ghosts given substance. I turned and ran for the RV, fumbling for my keys. Behind me, I could hear Sarah's laughter multiplying, echoing off the mountains until it sounded like a chorus of the damned. The RV's engine turned over on the third try. I threw it into reverse, not caring about the careful setup we'd spent hours perfecting. The awning tore free with a sound like ripping fabric. Camp chairs flew in all directions. In the rearview mirror, I could see Sarah standing at the water's edge, no longer alone. The entire ghostly congregation had emerged from the lake, and they watched my departure with identical expressions of patient hunger. The dirt road had never seemed longer. Every turn revealed new obstacles. Fallen trees that hadn't been there hours before, washouts that appeared fresh despite the lack of recent rain. Twice I had to back up and find alternate routes, guided by instinct rather than any map or GPS. My phone remained dead, showing no signal despite my increasingly desperate attempts to call for help. The radio picked up nothing but static, broken by occasional fragments of what might have been voices speaking in that same strange language I'd heard by the lake. It was full dark by the time I reached the main road, though I was certain I'd left in broad daylight. The Winnebago's headlights carved a narrow tunnel through absolute blackness, and I pressed the accelerator harder, desperate to put distance between myself and Whispering Pines. I drove straight through to Albany, stopping only for gas and to check my phone. The first signal bar appeared as I crossed the city limits, and immediately my phone began buzzing with missed calls and messages. The most recent was from Sarah, sent just minutes before. "Where are you? I'm worried sick. You disappeared while I was napping and your phone goes straight to voicemail. Please call me. The lake is so beautiful at night." My hands shook as I dialed 911. The police were patient, but skeptical. I told them everything. The strange campground, Sarah's behavior, the figures in the lake. They took notes and assured me they'd send someone to check on the situation. "Whispering Pines, you said?" The desk sergeant frowned. "That name doesn't ring a bell. You sure about the location?" I gave them the handwritten directions, exactly as I remembered them. The officer promised to look into it, but his expression suggested he thought I was either lying or suffering from some kind of breakdown. 3 days later, they called with their findings. No campground by that name existed in the Adirondacks. The location I described was state forest land, completely undeveloped. The dirt road I'd followed was an old logging path that dead-ended at a small lake. "We did find some interesting stuff out there, though," the officer said. "Old foundation stones, some rusted equipment. Local historical society says there was a logging operation in that area back in the 1800s. Mill burned down in 1847, killed a bunch of workers. What about my wife?" A pause. "Sir, there's no record of anyone named Sarah Anderson being reported missing. And, according to our files, you checked yourself into Albany Medical Center's psychiatric wing yesterday evening." I hung up and stared at the hospital room around me. White walls, plastic furniture, the smell of industrial disinfectant. Through the reinforced window, I could see the city spreading out below, full of lights and normal human activity. The doctors say I suffered a psychotic break brought on by stress and grief. They have files documenting my wife's death 6 months ago, a car accident on her way home from the grief counselor's office where we'd been trying to process our miscarriage. They show me photos of her funeral, which apparently I attended in a dissociative state. They say I rented the RV myself, drove it to that abandoned logging site, and spent 3 days alone in the wilderness talking to hallucinations. They say the camping forum I found online never existed, that I created an elaborate fantasy to cope with trauma I couldn't face. Maybe they're right. Maybe grief and guilt drove me to the edge of madness, and everything I experienced at Whispering Pines was the product of a mind desperate to undo losses that couldn't be undone. But if that's true, why do I still receive text messages from Sarah's phone? "The lake misses you," came through this morning. "We all do. But don't worry, you'll find your way back to us eventually. Everyone does." The doctors say I'm sending the messages to myself, some kind of elaborate self-deception. They've confiscated my phone and started me on new medications that make everything feel distant and cottony. But late at night, when the hospital is quiet and the medication begins to wear off, I can hear water lapping against an unseen shore. And sometimes, if I listen very carefully, I can hear Sarah calling my name across impossible distances, her voice carried on wind that smells of pine needles and something deeper, something that might be eternity. They say I'm getting better. They say I'll be released soon, ready to start rebuilding my life. They don't understand that some losses can't be processed, some grief can't be counseled away. They don't understand that Whispering Pines isn't just a place. It's a promise, a guarantee that those we've lost are never truly gone, that love transcends the boundaries between world and dream, life and death, sanity and the kind of truth that can only be found in the deepest, darkest waters. I'm scheduled for discharge next Tuesday, and I know exactly where I'm going when they set me free. The lake is waiting. Sarah is waiting, and this time, I won't run away.